quickly turn the mic over to them. So we'll start with Professor Zaire Dinzey Flores, who is an associate professor of sociology and Latino and Caribbean studies at Rutgers University, and the author of the award-winning Locked In, Locked Out, Gated Communities in a Puerto Rican City, which came out in 2013. Her paper or presentation will be From Crack to Manor, Racial Matter and Sensitive Design. We'll then turn to Derek Hyra, who is a professor at American University in the Department of Public Administration, who is the author of a number of books, including The New Urban Renewal, The Economic Transformation of Harlem and Bronzeville, which came out in 2008, and then more recently, Race, Class, and Politics in the Cappuccino City, which came out in 2017 with the University of Chicago Press. His talk is called Rent Gaps, Race, and REITs, or Real Estate Interest Trusts, I think, or something like that. And last but not least, we'll hear from Hamish Kallin, who is based at the University of Edinburgh, and who is co-editor with Giovanni Gioli of an upcoming book with the Edinburgh University Press, Thinking as Anarchists, Selected Writings from Volanta. So I'm really excited to hear about from all three panelists, and each panelist has around 20 minutes to talk, which will leave, I think, more than enough time for questions and comments at the end, including my own thoughts. And all of them, obviously, given the panel topic, will speak to Neil Smith's fifth chapter in Neil Smith's book on gentrification. So social arguments on gentrification. So with that, let me turn it over to Professor Dinzey Flores.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to share my screen. Yesterday, I had to participate mainly as an auditor, but I'm happy to today be more in dialogue with everyone. But I really enjoyed yesterday's presentations and got a lot of inspiration and learned a lot too. I wasn't sure what to present today, and I decided to show a bit of the chapter I'm currently muddling through. So this is all kind of schematic still, but a chapter that is part of a book manuscript that I'm working on, which focuses on the ways in which real estate actors and their practices physically and symbolically mark race and class distinctions through residential properties and neighborhoods built environments in Brooklyn. And the ways that these actors and racial practices, and by real estate actors, I mean residents, buyers, sellers, realtors, commentators, community groups, community boards. So in essence, all community members, how they inform material and symbolic value of properties in the neighborhoods. So today I'm going to present just a bit of this chapter, which focuses on discussions about the proper design for a building in the Bedford-Stuyvesant area, or Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn, where I also lived, have lived and made community for the past 15 years. A little background on Bed-Stuy. Bedford-Stuyvesant is considered a center for Black diasporic community, including one of the first free African-American communities. Let me see if I can switch slides here. Including one of the first free African-American communities, but also composed of Southern African-American immigrants, Harlem transplants, Caribbean and continental African immigrants. From the early 20th century. And in highlighting the diversity of this community, I obviously want to challenge blanket reductive portrayals of Black communities that dominate much scholarship, noting, for example, the erasure of Afro-Latinas and other Black diasporic communities in the process, as well as class differences and great class variance. Bed-Stuy has been touted as the largest concentration of Blacks in New York City and one of the largest in the country. For at least a couple of decades, Bed-Stuy has been experiencing a demographic shift, which began more slowly and has been continually accelerating in place over the past decade, with an increasing population of whites and declining Black population and the ensuing rise in property values. So I'm not going to provide more details about Bed-Stuy in the interest of time, and thankfully yesterday, Amanda Boston also talked a bit about Central Brooklyn. So I'm thankful for the work in this group, collective work that also kind of like sets the stage for some of this discussion without having to kind of talk about the particularities of this neighborhood. So I'm going to jump into what I'm trying to discern through this particular chapter and how it highlights and maybe perhaps humbly pushes forward some of what Neil Smith offered in his work. So I'll start with the ethnographic moment that animates the chapter. So I start. On this winter January weekday night, the agreement forged over social media was to meet at a new local bar in the heart of Bed-Stuy. After a round of introductions, 9 of us, all residents, some long-term, some newer, 1 Black man, 3 Black women, including me, 2 white women, one of whom was, I found out, Latina, and 3 white men. The conversation about what to do about new developments in the neighborhood turned to a so-called crack building. I followed the conversation about the crack building with confusion. Were they talking about crack, as in crack cocaine? Was the building they were discussing a drug house? Deep associations from the 1980s clouded my judgment from my understanding of the history of Bed-Stuy and inner city discourse, but also because I too grew up in the 80s, though in a colonial outpost of the war on drugs that during the 80s held the sketchy honor of having the highest per capita murder rate in the world. And that was south and across the Atlantic in Puerto Rico, where I am right now. It is only deep into the conversation about ideas for intervening with developers about appropriate design that I got clarity on the drug issue. When the subtle innuendos veiled in speech about adequacy and sensitive design became clear. One of the attendees, a Black woman, intervened with 1 white man who had been complaining about the difficulties in organizing against developers and advocating for good design in this neighborhood because of what he called the big issue. Which issue? Responded the Black woman. Race? She followed with certitude. Well, sometimes you have to be willing to stand in the back of the line. This Black woman had already interfered, saying, quote, this discussion is about gentrification and no one can or is able, wants to talk about gentrification because it becomes a conversation about race and gentrification and displacement, and you, she addressed another white man, can't lead the conversation. Upon the ongoing complaint of 1 white man, quote, Bed-Stuy is just different. Black woman responded as if she'd had enough. It's not. You just have to know how to do it. And she retorted matter-of-factly, and the crack house is now the boarded up house because there is no crack involved. The use of the term crack turns out was not a literal reference to crack cocaine, as I had supposed, and I'm sure many others had supposed, nor was it a literal reference to the building, but instead it was a descriptor popularized in social media and discussion forums for the design presented in the rendering of a proposed building. The design, which included a vertical lighting bulb of silvery glass windows dripping down the side of a Black concrete facade, earned the building that some consider to be the humorous moniker, the crack house, that Black women had had enough of. The proposed design had erupted in neighborhood forums, newspapers, comments, and conversations with crack descriptors. People labeled the building the Bulgarian neo-goth supervillain crack lair. It looks like an evil crack lair, or claim, no need to give out an address, just look for the ugliest building on the block. In fact, building address is the crack house. I see Black women's intervention that there is no crack, to stop calling it crack, that it is a boarded up building. And this is the actual boarded up building she was referring to, and that everyone was referring to, the location. So I think of this intervention as what McKittrick might label a spatial act, a place-based critique, or a respatialization, challenging the very traditional geographic arrangements that shape and delimit Black women's experiences with space. McKittrick states that, quote, spatial acts can take on many forms and can be identified through expressions, resistances, and naturalizations, end of quote. So in my understandings, this Black woman's comment and the conversation in terms or labels and languages floating around this meeting and the many online and live discussions around the proper design of this building exposed the racial undertones, silences, frictions, debates, and to use Dolores Hayden's terms, territorial histories cloaked in physical form. The quote, mind and matter, which is Dolores Hayden's terms as well. As Judy Atfield reminds, conversations about aesthetics turn buildings from things to designs, from the banal and imperceptible to the socially and politically significant, to living and breathing matter. So I focus on this concept of matter very intentionally. I take these race articulations to kind of bring into the forum, to the conversation, Stuart Hall, right? The articulations, racial articulations, to focus on the discursive, textual, and aesthetic negotiations that make matter, buildings in this case, beyond their capitalistic dimensions as product and things of accumulation, a social racial matter, also containing the qualities of culture, race, and identity and community that have symbolic social capital that also gets managed in material value and is undeniably related to the market. So let me show you more. Much of the conversation about the design revolved around what was appropriate for the neighborhood. The expression was what was quote unquote sensitive design. To debate what was exactly sensitive meant and what sensitive looked like, and I'm doing some work on the affective use of these terms, like what's sensitivity. So at stake was what sensitive design can and will do, what it can prevent, what it can guarantee or not for this neighborhood, but more importantly for the residents' imagination of place along varying framings, what Mario Small has called neighborhood narrative frames that are elaborated and that shape how people act towards the community along ethno-racial and historical lines. So the crack house versus boarded up house debate, in the chapter, I go through the full exploration, of course, about what crack meant for a neighborhood like Bed-Stuy, which very literally experienced the impacts brought on by racist structural disinvestment, the havocs of subsistence, informal and drug economies, and youth, and the ensuing stigmas that those brought on. I do so also for the boarded up qualifier or label, which became its own structured spatial lexicon, a mainstay indicator of urban negligence as much for policymakers as for the academy and suburbanites. Abandonment, vacancy, boards, and broken windows came to denote destitution, downturn so seamlessly that ecological research typified by crime ecology developed theories and methods and tools like systematic social observation that measured criminality through the presence of broken windows and affixed wooden planks in the facade of buildings. Still, I argue there is a nuanced turn that a boarded up building affords. The boarded up descriptor frees up the strong crack stigmas by sticking closely to the physical qualities of the building, underscoring the structural and material conditions of precarity and their multiple manifestations. While crack foregrounds the cultural pathologies of behaviors attributed to crackheads and drug use, a boarded up building casts the possibility of a future that crack surely precludes. Black women's near aggressive, annoyed affirmation that there is no crack removes the stench of crack and unlikely rescues the building, claims it a space, an empty vessel rather than a pathological coffin. To pull back on the reference to crack and replace it with boarded up buildings, Black woman refocuses the sign and significations of the physical qualities of the status of the building rather than cracks encoded racial statement. I think she's having the racial conversations that is being skirted with the crack reference to animate a conversation on improper design. Clearly, the rearticulation of boarded up design doesn't save the original buildings, and this is something I discussed in the chapter at length, why the focus was never about preserving these original structures or saving them, even though there was a preservationist bent on many of the interlocutors in the conversation. Because ironically, both crack and boarded up will inevitably pave the way for a new building, not the boarded up building, not the crack building design. And I think here I'm invoking some of the work that Rosemary and Dubuisiu has done, who's at Georgetown in thinking in DC about how different communities get involved in conversations about what addressing community issues should look like, and kind of like not releasing also communities of color from their participation in the production of new environments. And I would also kind of like note Joanna's Londoño's work with the brokers, and somebody also commented yesterday, which was really great, and the presentation as well yesterday is about developers, which showcase how communities of color participate differentially and not necessarily in kind of like these stereotypical predictive ways in the new production of the communities. Let's see. So in debating the new sensitive building should look like, there are disagreements, however, in what it should look like. And these disagreements are indeed born in racial terms and differing historical framings of the neighborhood. For example, there was a debate about what sensitive design actually looked like, and there were differences aligned around racial terms and the historical relationships to the community. One white resident highly invested in preservation and landmarking efforts stated that, quote, Stuyvesant East looks pretty much like it did 120 years ago, and that's a remarkable thing. While a Black resident who had similar preservationist interests said, people come to the neighborhood because of Victorian architecture. If I could transport myself to Victorian Brooklyn, maybe I would, but as a white man. So one resident said, also, Bed-Stuy is not a museum. While another responded, Brooklyn is not a museum, but it is a place with a distinct character that many of the people who live here have worked very hard to preserve. So in the quote, the highly debated design and way of speaking about the design illustrates the terms under which differently racialized publics, residents, community members, and stakeholders were framing the neighborhood, casting its past, determining what it was and needed to preserve, and rethinking its future, and protecting its patronage through the built environment, or what they thought the patronage was. These conversations helped me think through the multi-scalar dimensions of gentrification and the racial logics embedded in the terms of the productions of places, physical place, but also aesthetic place and symbolic place. So beyond thinking through the structural dimensions of how policy, governments, and the private market facilitate gentrification, an important endeavor, we also might think about what Ana Yolanda Ramos Sayas calls the moral economies of privilege, which support the infrastructure that facilitate exclusion and destruction of communities. So with specific racial logic, Ramos-Sayas writes, quote, "This moral economy of privilege unfolds not primarily at the macro levels of the state or the nation, but at the intimate levels of everyday life through the control structures of feelings in neighborhoods and communities. This is not to say that these intimate level forms of sociability overtake or supersede macro scale of institutions, quite the contrary. The most enduring institutions in the nation state projects are those that benefit from the moral economies that cultivate, sustain, and foster racial privilege through ordinary forms of intimacy and kinship," end of quote. So in my work, I'm trying to think through these intimate, mundane, everyday ways in which neighborhoods become aesthetic productions to be more actively and more valuably consumed. These spatial and design utterances also take seriously Catherine McKittrick's call to take, quote, "take the language and the physicality of geography seriously," that is, as an imbrication of materials and metaphorical space, so that Black lives and Black histories can be conceptualized and talked about in new ways. And that these overlaps between materiality and language are longstanding in the diaspora, end of quote. So I'm aiming here to mobilize these conversations and debates and architectural productions as racial matter that transacts in symbolic and material value in the frame of what Neil Smith terms, quote, "demand-led urbanization," in which consumption landscapes supersede production landscapes and have a highly spatial identity. This indeed highlights one of the contributions of Neil Smith in the chapter we are focusing on about the social and its intersections with the aesthetic. Smith suggested that the, quote, "new middle classes that participate in gentrification demand culturally distinct products, consumption-led urbanization, not just accumulation of objects, as in David Harvey's theorization of capitalistic demand-led urbanization. Class position and identity is constituted through aesthetic tastes that seek, quote, "the pursuit of difference, diversity, and distinction, as long as it is highly ordered, and a glorification of the past, as long as it is safely brought into the present." I'm gonna further quote Smith here when he writes, quote, "urban conservation is one mechanism through which social differences are turned into social distinctions. Slums become Victoriana, and housing becomes a cultural investment with facado displays signifying a social ascension. The ambiguity and compromise of the new middle classes is revealed in their aesthetic taste. In the case of urban conservation, those consumption practices are anxiously doubled up on what may be termed a Victorian work ethic embedded in renovation work. In artistic terms, this duality is expressed as that of form and function. The effacing of an industrial past and a working class presence, as in crack, the whitewashing of a former social stain was achieved through extensive remodeling. The return to historical purity and authenticity of the high Victorian era is realized by stripping away external additions, by sandblasting, by internal gutting. So the crack building was never built. Instead, after public pressure, the building ended up as the Hancock Manor, with what was touted to be a more conventional and traditional design, a contemporary 7-story mixed-use building with interesting massing and retail on the ground floor. That's how it was described. Or, quote, "a traditional design that mixes red brick and white stucco with big windows, balconies, and nary a rendered bird to be seen." So a manor in Bed-Stuy, which literally means a large country house in a landed estate granted by royal charter in a British colony by the Dutch governors in New York State. Here too, Neil Smith's words are instructive, and I'll end with this quote. Quote, "whether in the herbs, burbs, or exurbs, however, the perpetual search for this difference and distinction amid mass consumption is eternally frustrated. It can lead to a new gentrification kitsch, in which cultural difference itself becomes mass-produced. Where such modern infill occurs in gentrifying neighborhoods, the impression is one of having come full circle in geographical and cultural as well as architectural terms. This infill gentrification is accomplishing a suburbanization of the city," end of quote. So Hancock Manor. I'll end there. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to a conversation.
Thank you. We'll hold on the questions until we hear from both Derek and Hamish, but please write the questions down, or you can put them in the chat and I'll try to keep track of them. So let me turn it to Professor Hyra to hear about REITs.
All right. Can everybody hear me? Just get a thumbs up. Looks like it. All right. I just want to start by thanking Albany and Johanna and Zawadi and Tim. I mean, this is just incredible to bring all these people together over these 2 days to thoroughly integrate gentrification and really celebrate Neil Smith's work. I learned so much yesterday that I changed my presentation. It did have rent gaps in it, but I took it out because I figured let's just talk about race and real estate investment trusts and redevelopment. So I wanted to say that I met Neil Smith in the early 2000s. I was at the University of Chicago. I did a scholar exchange with Columbia University. I was doing my doctoral dissertation research looking at the redevelopment of Harlem, and had the opportunity to meet him at CUNY. And you know, this our panel is chapter 5, but I'll take some liberty and take it to chapter 7, which is on Harlem, and Harlem's the catch-22 of whether Harlem is gentrifying. And I read that before I got to New York, and what a wonderful experience to be able to live in Harlem, research what was going on in Harlem, and then talk to Neil Smith about what he had seen in the past in Harlem and how he saw the redevelopment moving forward. So I would say that after reading his book, I really, thought I was going to come into Harlem and study the gentrifiers. We talked yesterday about there's so many studies on the gentrifiers coming in, their tastes and preferences, how are they shaping neighborhoods. But after I read this book, I got my prop too. I always talk with props. So after I read the book, I was like, wait a minute, I got to interview city officials. I got to understand the politics of redevelopment. I don't necessarily have to only interview the gentrifiers and the politicians. I got to interview the bankers who are giving the real estate developers money. So JP Morgan Chase took me forever, but I finally got an interview with some people there. So I think, for me, Neil Smith's work really pushed to get a laser focus on production dynamics. So the politics and also the politics of capital flows. And I really feel that to understand gentrification, you have to understand the tastes and preferences and the consumption dynamics, but the production dynamics are just as important. And I think that's what his work really contributed. All right, let me see if I can forward the slides. So for the talk, and let's see, we've got about 15 minutes, but I want to talk a little bit about what drives gentrification, how have gentrification drivers changed over time, and what are the implications of this for contemporary studies of gentrification. Some of what I'm going to talk about is going to pull from a current working paper that I have under review, really trying to lay out what I think are some of the emerging gentrification dynamics from 2010 to 2020, and maybe from 2021 and beyond. So we've got the two core books that I think are talking to one another, two people in New York City sort of debating whether we have consumption dynamics really driving the gentrification processes or the production dynamics. Sharon Zukin's book comes out in '82. Neil Smith's comes out in 1996, but his work is really based on early mid '80s, right, of New York City. So I love pictures and I think they speak well, but for Sharon's work, it's like, this is what you focus on, right? You're focusing on the newcomers, and this is some newcomers coming to the Shaw U Street area, related to one of my prior books in Washington, D.C. But focusing on the young white millennials who are moving back into communities of color, And I think it is important to focus on their tastes and preferences, because real estate developers are doing their surveys. They're figuring out how to build the product, right? The design of the building, the amenities to have in the community that will attract upper income people so that they can buy low and sell high. So the taste and preferences of the gentrifiers are important to understand what's happening. But at the same time, I think we really got to focus on the production dynamics, the policies that relate to the capital flows that come into communities that basically help to give the construction loan to undergird. And what you see right here is the tax increment financing district in Washington, D.C.'s Southwest neighborhood. And this is the waterfront. I have a project now studying the financing and the implications of this $1 billion investment. But of the $1 billion, almost 300 million of them are public funds. 200 million are related to a tax increment financing district. So I think Neil Smith would have us look at this and understand the capital flows and the politics behind the capital flows to really to undergird and understand the landscape and the changes that are taking place in areas that are redeveloping. So this is kind of where we ended, I think, and had a lot of discussion yesterday. Yeah, but what about race? I think Sharon and Neil did not really focus. They touched on racial dynamics, but their studies did not really have a core racial lens. And this is a picture of Docha, which is a beer garden in the Shaw U Street neighborhood, which is the Harlem of Washington, D.C. And you've got a mural of Elizabeth Taylor. Mostly white people go to this bar. And then you have someone who's a minority kind of walking by looking in. And I've spoke to people who live around this bar who are long-term residents of color, and that picture captures kind of how they feel. They feel very excluded. So from this, so we have to unpack and understand race, right? So Amanda Elizabeth Zawadi study that she has in urban studies that came out recently, all are trying to get us to look at gentrification through a racial lens. And I would say that I think that Neil Smith didn't do that enough. But I would say that, you know, let's not just like focus on Neil Smith, like let's look at the Chicago school, right? I went to the University of Chicago, so I got to throw this up there. And it's the, you know, the human ecology model of Park and Burgess. And, you know, they have the segmentation of neighborhoods and how segregated Chicago was in the early 20th century. And we've got the Black Belt on Chicago's South Side. But Park and Burgess, even though they experienced racial segregation, they knew about racial covenances, they knew about racial zoning that segregated the city, but their theories didn't incorporate that. So I think, you know, but, you know, we shouldn't worry too much. It's like, okay, people didn't focus on these things, but as Brandy Summers talked about, we've got a bunch of scholars who are remembering race and race in the context of US neighborhood change and gentrification. So Nathan Connolly's book, take it, you know, to the early 20th century. Mindy Fullylove's Root Shock, the mid 20th century, and then Brandy brings us into the late 20th, early 21st century. So I think we have a bunch of scholars, and I'll include Zawadi and her work that's coming out is really trying to center race within the US context of understanding gentrification. And I would argue that we must understand race when we do the analysis of gentrification in the US. All right, so now I want to sort of shift a little bit to talk about another contribution of Neil Smith, and it's not necessarily in the book that we're focusing on, but it's in some of his articles. But what drives gentrification over time? And why I want to talk about this is I think we've had these waves of gentrification. Right? We've had at different time periods in the 20th and 21st century, there are dynamics of urbanism that have changed over time. And I think gentrification scholars are constantly trying to figure out what are the core dynamics that are influencing the built and social environment. And they have changed. They are not stagnant and they are not the same. And they change throughout different time periods and in different contexts. And again, we talked about this yesterday. But here I put up the waves of gentrification, and this is, basically coming out of Jason Hackworth and Neil Smith's 2001 article. And I think what they and others like Tom Slater and Loretta Lees, right, and Elvin Wiley, who I think is on the call. The wave is important. So wave one in the 1970s, or we could take it back to the 1960s. This is Ruth Glass's work, right? She coins the term gentrification. She said we really got to look at the gentrifiers. But I think then Neil Smith comes along and says, hey, wait, in the 80s, there are small real estate development firms. They're really important. The politics of the city and the tax breaks they're giving to developers are important, and also the gentrifiers and their taste and preferences. We've got to take all of that together. But then Jason Hackworth comes in and says, hey, wait a minute, in the US in the 90s, this is Hope 6, this is state-led gentrification. The state is funneling money to cities, and this is related to the knocking down of public housing, and this is the core driver. But when we get into the 2000s, we get wave 4 and wave 5, and now housing financialization, the subprime lending market, low interest rates are becoming really important to understand why neighborhoods are changing, maybe like Harlem, that have spent 50 years impoverished. But then we get to the 2010 period and beyond, forget about subprime lending. It's not happening in the US. But what is happening is housing financialization related to the rental market. And that's where the real estate investment trusts are going. And I'll unpack that and get into that a little bit more. But I just thought I'd show this. Jason's work, Cabrini Green, we got the Starbucks, who's getting their lattes, but, there's also a lot of money coming in to knock down Cabrini Green and build $400,000, $500,000 townhomes. But that's wave 3. Wave 4 is basically 2010 to 2020. Sorry, that's 2000 to 2010, that's wave 4, and that's where we get a rise in subprime lending. And we got a whole bunch of authors, a bunch of books talking about housing financialization as being a really core production dynamic to explain gentrification. We get the mortgage foreclosures, the crisis. We get millions of people in the United States who were homeowners that get pushed into the rental market. We have the rise of the renters. And now we have a rental crisis in the United States. So we have to sort of think about who is buying the foreclosed homes that are single family and converting them into rentals, and who also is buying the multifamily rental buildings now in the United States. Well, it's people and institutions like Blackstone, right? Blackstone is a multinational real estate company, and they have several real estate investment trusts, and so do many of the institutional banks. So it used to be that these banking funds would buy secondary mortgage markets, right? They'd bundle securities related to single family homes. Well, now they are buying single family homes and they are putting it into their investment portfolio, and they are renting those homes out. So I think that we really have to think about, in this 5th wave from 2010 to 2020, the housing financialization within the rental market in the US and abroad, but it's really, Blackstone invests all around the world. But in the US, they did gobble up a lot of single family homes and rented them out in these large portfolios. So there is an increased financialization that was once in the homeownership market through subprime that has now moved into the rental market, into single family and multifamily homes. I think this is one of the core drivers of the gentrification that we are seeing today. And I think that will continue with what I think will be a 6th wave within the US of gentrification that has started now in 2021, and it will continue, and it will be related to the COVID crisis. And all of the funds that are going into the redevelopment, or going to stimulate the emergence of the US economy. We have spent trillions of dollars, and that is going to ramp up the rental real estate market. We also have a ton of people who couldn't make their rents who are going to be evicted. And when they are evicted, there's going to be a vacancy. Who is going to gobble up that property? They are going to be institutions like Blackstone. So some of the dynamics from the fifth wave are going to spill over into the sixth wave. So what are some of the contemporary gentrification implications of this? You know, I think that, you know, Neil Smith, I think, really pushed us to sort of look at, again, you know, who are the real estate developers? Where were they getting their capital from? And how were they involved in flipping properties? So, but now we can kind of see that that capital went into the mortgage market, and now that capital is going into the rental market. So I think we really need to sort of capture the production dynamics. And in this contemporary period, I think the production dynamics that we need to keep an eye on are investments in single family and multifamily rental market. That is really going to determine a good amount of the gentrification, at least that happens in the US going forward. I think we must look at capital investment mechanisms like real estate investment trusts, tax increment financing districts, and business improvement districts. These will be the mechanisms that filter international and domestic capital into particular districts that then gentrify. The other thing is that we have to examine the role of race in this process. Again, we talked yesterday about that we have whopping racial wealth and income inequality. So when developers go in and buy low and want to sell high, it will have racial implications within the US. So if we don't sort of incorporate race in our analysis of contemporary gentrification, I think we're missing a lot of the processes related to the redevelopment and also the consequences of that redevelopment. And the last thing I'll kind of end on this, because we talked, I love that Rebecca opened up this entire conference with just talking the politics of minimizing displacement. And I think to minimize displacement going forward in areas that get investments, we have to regulate the housing financialization. And in particular, we have to regulate the real estate investment trusts that are going to flood money into communities for making profit. How much profit can they make? When can they put the money? When can they take it out of a community? I think we really have to think seriously about regulating that if we want to minimize some of the displacement that may occur. And I will just end with this slide. I always have my family somewhere in my presentations. That's my son right there. And this is a Right to the City exhibit that was in the Anacostia Community Museum in Washington, D.C. And he doesn't look like that anymore, by the way. During the pandemic, he sprouted up like 6 inches. So he's about as tall as I am now. But you know, it's sort of, he's thinking and contemplating who has the right to the city. And anyone should have the right to the city, not just those with the means to afford the luxury condos and the luxury rental apartments. But I think that if we are going to maintain a right to the city for everyone, we really have to think about how we regulate housing markets and the production dynamics related to the flooding of capital to particular places really needs to be regulated from the national level, but also from the city level. So I hope my son sort of moves forward in life and goes and tries to do policies that will allow all people to have the right to the city. So thank you.
Thank you. Lastly, I'll turn it over to Hamish, and then we can, we'll definitely have time for comments and questions.
Okay, cool. Hopefully you can hear me. Can you hear me? Good. It's Hamish, by the way, but that's fine. I don't know why you'd know that, so that's cool.
My apologies.
That's fine. It's totally fine. So yeah, hello and thanks for having me. I've got to say it is a little bit intimidating to be amongst so many Americans. I think it's the first time in my life that I've sort of felt that. So I thought I'd start by just reminding you that The New Urban Frontier was actually written by a Scotsman. And rereading it, I found it quite funny noticing some of the ways that becomes clear. So, for example, who else would use the phrase conceptual Calvinism to describe dogmatic Marxists, or make so many fleeting references to Dalkeith? And if you've no idea where that is, well, fair enough, because it's like a tiny ex-mining town just south of Edinburgh, but it's where Neil grew up. Now, that doesn't really matter. It's basically irrelevant to what I'm going to talk about. But it reminded me of the joy that I felt when the only time I ever actually saw Neil speak, when he started to speak, and this kind of Scottish accent poured out with such ferocity. And all of that is to say, it's a real honour to be here. I read New Urban Frontier when I was an undergrad. It was actually Tom Slater who told me to read it. So thanks, Tom. And it changed my life in the sense that it made me want to do a PhD. And one of the ideas in it that's always really fascinating me is revanchism, and I've never quite managed to get my head around it. It's not, I'm a bit like Derek. I'm usually a production kind of guy. I focus on capitalism and money and profit and so on. But I want to talk about revanchism. I've been trying to get sort of stuck into it a wee bit. Because revanchism absolutely suffuses the book, right? It frames it. It's at the beginning and it's at the end. It's the most kind of spectacular, memorable set pieces of violence in the New Urban Frontier are about revanchism. Neil Smith actually wanted the book to be called The Revanchist City, but the publisher intervened because they thought the word wasn't clear enough, and that led to a reshuffle. It's an idea that fascinates me because it kind of writes into the foundations of this Marxist theory of gentrification. Things that are often decried as absences, so state power would be one. Racism would be another, though I think, I think we'd all agree that it doesn't quite develop that as much as he needed to. But also culture, imagined following Don Mitchell as a kind of terrain of ideological struggle that suffuses everyday life. But it does so somewhat incompletely, right? We don't quite know what to do with revanchism. Because the other sort of core ideas of the book, the frontier, the rent gap, gentrification, are so tightly intertwined. They have such a tight logic that is, based basically on Marx, about money. Revanchism sort of sits outside that. Yes, it's about money, but it's about a lot more. It's about hatred and fear and paranoia and so on. And so it doesn't fit intuitively into the theory of gentrification to such an extent that most people don't mention it. If you read the majority of gentrification literature, really often doesn't mention revanchism at all. And so the ideas have kind of become a bit disconnected over the years, which is something that is partly why I wanted to revisit it. There's a tantalizing line near the beginning of the book where Neil says that in many ways, the vengefulness of the fin de siècle revanchist city has overtaken gentrification as a script for the urban future. Now, this seems at first glance like a miscalculation, right? Especially if you weighed the scholarship on gentrification or revanchism by the ton. You'd think that gentrification completely outweighed revanchism rather than the other way around. But I'm not so sure, or at least I wasn't sure, which is why I started to sort of read around the concept of revanchism. And I want to try and do a couple of things in this, in however long I've got, to basically convince you that revanchism is important to gentrification, but also beyond gentrification, but also to show that it's a concept in need of clarification and perhaps hint at some of the ways that we might do that. Wasn't quite sure how to present this, so I've just opted for a series of short interjections in no particular order, and I hope that works, but we'll see. So the first is that I don't think it's an understatement to say that we are living in a revanchist moment. In recent years, and I'm referencing papers all published since 2017, and I'm intentionally ignoring the urban studies stuff to make a point, revanchism has been used to describe things as variable as the racism of the Brexit campaign in the UK, the feelings of resentment, vengeance, anger, and humiliation behind Trump's America, the link between nationalist identity politics and Europe's securitized borders, the production of cheap, exploitable labor through the racialization of gypsies in Romania, the rise of nativist activism in Hong Kong, and more, right? A long list of seemingly disconnected processes. Now, on the one hand, this makes me, sort of theoretically, it makes me kind of excited to see such a use of the word, but it also makes me slightly itchy. For what does the word mean if it means so much in so many different contexts? But between these examples, the contemporary relevance of the idea could hardly be clearer, right? We can't sort of think that revanchism is something that belonged to New York in the 1990s. It clearly sort of reaches beyond that in time and space. And in many of these examples, it actually completely leaves gentrification behind altogether. It seems to have nothing to do with it. That multiplicity of the word obviously brings with it its own challenges. Max Hyven had a book that came out last year called Revenge Capitalism. And in it, revanchism is used to describe everything from the toxic masculinity of Gamergate to money itself. In other words, a stage of capitalism where revenge is a recurring motif. On page 1 of a book that leaves you waiting in vain for a definition of the word, and I'm being slightly pedantic, but it is a good book, he tells us that 10 years after the global financial meltdown of 2008, the world is haunted by revanchist politics, far-right, reactionary and neo-fascist formations that seem to be based not on any glorious vision of a better future, but on taking revenge for what they think of as a stolen past. Now, it's hard to disagree, right? But what distinguishes the word once its spatial implications are stripped away? How does this connect back to gentrification, if at all? We either need a sharper conception of revanchism that can speak to all these myriad examples, or we need to stop assuming that the word has much explanatory power. But one thing is for sure, the revanchist turn refuses to sort of stay in the context that Neil studied it in. And like gentrification, it really has kind of proliferated in terms of how the concept is used. And probably like gentrification, that means that scholars of revanchism will kind of get slightly angsty about the conceptual thinness of the word. The second point I kind of want to make is that revanchism has never been local, never been only local anyway, kind of response to that fear that it's become conceptually stretched. Smith's revanchist city thesis was developed in a very specific context, New York City in the mid-1990s. But it didn't stay there because it wasn't really born there. We can talk of the diffusion of revanchist polities. So in the sense that from the late 90s onwards, some combination of anti-homeless legislation, the criminalization and displacement of sex workers as street traders, zero tolerance policing, and the rise of private security in notionally public spaces was observed in major cities across the US and beyond, especially in Latin America and Europe. Sometimes this was through copycat legislation, so looking at New York and thinking, well, that worked. But in many instances, it was also through direct and very profitable policy export through consultancy firms. So famously, both Giuliani and Bratton, his police chief, both set up private consultancy firms kind of after they left office and basically started to sell that blueprint to the world. But in the new urban frontier, the discussion of revanchism is geopolitical and municipal simultaneously from its inception, right? It's not just about diffusion. It's about the rediscovery of enemies within that situates New York City into a global nexus of war, terrorism, nationalism, and immigration that affects gentrification on the ground because it feeds the paranoia of the rich. It exacerbates the defensive tendencies of those with more than their neighbors. It turns up the volume of racism and fuels the perceived need for security that seems to trickle down far more readily than wealth ever could. In this sense, when Smith refers to the central character of the 1990 film Bonfire of the Vanities as the archetypal revanchist, a white upper-class male unreasonably victimized by a world he no longer controls, and I don't know about you, but feels like a pretty kind of familiar character in 2021. We can see the hardening of an ideology that has one foot in white middle-class fear of the city, the specific city, so in this instance, New York, its streets and so on, but another in the unraveling fantasy of capitalist globalization more broadly, in the ever clearer lines of inequality that would sort of haunt those with wealth. Already in 1996, Smith argued that the revanchist city is now recognized as an inherently international artifact. And this is expanded on with blistering effect in his 2009 paper on the revanchist planet, which kind of takes it from gentrification to the world. So he begins to link things as disparate as, Israeli bombing of Lebanon to kind of estate regeneration in London. And I think it's a paper that's not often cited because it's so difficult to deal with. How do you hold together these instances of spatial violence under one concept when they feel so disparate? Now, a full discussion of that paper will have to wait for another day, but I do think it's a crucial piece of the puzzle, or at least as I see it. The point that I want to make here is that revanchism is flexible in terms of scale. It does not describe a process that is essentially urban, notwithstanding arguments that everything is urban now anyway. So when Jeff DeVirtual suggests it would be irresponsible to presume a link between revanchist urban policies and a kind of authoritarian reactionary turn at the national level, I would agree only insofar as I think we should never presume anything, but I'm prone to head in the opposite direction, to see in revanchism not a phenomenon that has been recklessly upscaled from the city to the nation, but a phenomenon that never really belonged to the city to begin with. My third point is that revanchism isn't always explicit, and this is another thing that I think is often hard when we try to talk about it, because not everywhere it is as kind of violently policed as New York City. So when I think of contemporary revanchism, my mind kind of heads in two different, seemingly contradictory directions. On the one hand, we have that kind of viscerally militant form of revanchism, the generalization of the security state, with the kind of control strategies that saw the riot squads sent to Tompkins Square Park to disband homeless people has become really normalized, right? It's a normal facet of police activity across the Western world. You could take something like William Robertson's concept of accumulation by repression, or Stephen Graham's new military urbanism and Ruth Wilson Gilmore's prison fix. And you could add the anti-security work of Mark Neocleus on the centrality of police power to capitalism. In other words, you could do a survey of kind of contemporary literature about the centrality of security and police power to capitalism. You could cobble that all together and you'd have a vision of revanchist urbanism as a kind of hyper state-sponsored violence, a cocktail of dawn raids and draconian laws, surveillance, shields and batons, walls and prisons, eye-watering police budgets, right? And a political discourse that fixates on law and order, enemies within and without. And obviously that's true in a lot of contexts, right? But it isn't true in Edinburgh. And so on the other hand, I think it's increasingly necessary to understand what Bloch and Meyer would call implicit revanchism, where the everyday running of the liberal order is also sexist, classist, and racist, and it always has been. And it's always built its cities in that image. And I think about this a lot in the context of my own research, so just allow me a brief sort of segue into that world. A lot of what I've done is kind of look at peripheral ex-industrial working class areas on the edge of Edinburgh. And in particular, one neighborhood on the south side of the city that was sort of entirely a public housing sort of project, I guess you'd call it in America. And it was largely demolished at the beginning of the 21st century and has been kind of redeveloped as private housing. Now, I could take you on a walk through that neighborhood and I would not be able to show you kind of areas of pitched battles between the police and local resistance. Yeah, as a poor neighborhood on the edge of a mostly rich city, it had long been the subject of more intense police attention than most Edinburgh residents would recognize. Nothing that occurred in Edinburgh would pass a litmus test of revanchism if we use Giuliani's New York as a benchmark. But what has happened in this peripheral neighborhood of Edinburgh? Well, homes have been destroyed, memories erased, a community unraveled, its institutions defunded and shut down, its history recuperated into set pieces of a kind of light touch industrial heritage for people to go and visit. It was subjected first to decades of disinvestment, which contained their own violence, and in some ways we could think of as revanches, and then subject to the violence of reinvestment after. And all that takes place in a world where prejudice, representation, othering, and stigma are fundamental ideological components of uneven development, of how some areas get preservation orders and others are obliterated. And in that context, there is, to me, a slower kind of revanchism at play, a kind of class violence that is, of course, in other contexts, a racial violence that basically gets rid of the world that doesn't fit its own image, that enacts a kind of creative destruction that is finally targeted not just by where the most profitable land is. And I don't think you can understand those kind of strategies of reinvestment without thinking about more than monetary strategies of governance, basically. The fourth thing I want to say about revanchism, and I know that this is kind of a sort of whistle-stop tour, but hey-ho, I think I want to argue that revanchism is necessary to the survival of capitalism. And I think in the case of Smith, he shows that quite clearly in the context of gentrification. So he shows how the financialization of the city, its transformation into the next frontier of profitability, was never merely an economic phenomenon, because it relied on and relies on the displacement of all those whose bodies and land uses stand in the way of securing higher profits. And when rents alone can't do the job of displacing people, the state steps in. The two forms of displacement, rising prices and a more or less brutal cleaning up or demolition of the public realm, coalesced in the revanchist city of the 1990s through the elevation of security to a spatial strategy that was increasingly difficult to challenge. Catherine Mitchell and Catherine Beckett have a neat paper writing about New York at the same sort of time period as Neil, and they talk about how the financial security of the city was dependent on its physical security. So the more lucrative real estate speculation became, the higher the rent gap would open, the faster the frontier would move, and the more the disembodied power of finance capital would come to depend upon the viscerally embodied power of the police. Securitization as a financial strategy relies on faith in future value of real estate, and that future value has to be protected. And increasingly, it's protected by security on the ground. I also think about gentrification. You know, if you think about the generalization of gentrification, especially, and this is really clear in the UK, that the promise to kind of regenerate the inner city wasn't just about higher profits. It was tied to a kind of ideological and utopian image of cleanliness and security. So you think of the city kind of renovated into a landscape of superficially homogeneous affluence, right? And what revanchism does is it reminds us of how implicitly mean that blueprint is. For such a vision in the context of a society where wealth is generated by and generates its opposite could only ever unevenly be enforced through domination. Right? It requires force because it isn't real. That affluence is never homogeneous because it takes place in a city that's becoming even more unequal. And of course, such a vision, especially but not only in an American context, is explicitly racist from the drawing board to the finished product in terms of how those images of cleanliness and security are kind of symbolized. I often think, and I'm sorry, this is another sort of tangent, but I find it interesting. I often think about Stuart Hall's work on authoritarian populism in Britain, alongside the astonishing book, Policing the Crisis, which I can never quite get over. And I think of that as a really essential addendum to Neil Smith's work on the revanchist city. So obviously Hall et al. They never used the word revanchist, of course, but they were describing a moment of reactionary politics with its seeds in the kind of alienation of consumerism on the one hand, the crumbling of the industrial economy on the other, the dissolution of social networks of solidarity that accompanied both, and the resultant crisis of legitimacy of the state, which was to be solved in this context by a kind of far-reaching appeal to the ego of the white nation, a cultural term that both fed and fed off racism, galvanized imperial nostalgia, and reorientated British idealism whatever really existed. So the vengeful turn in 1970s British policy is best understood as an ideological response, cultivated and targeted, not organic, to a series of existential crises that set the capitalist state. And I do sometimes wonder if actually Hall's examination of that kind of crisis in a British context is actually a pretty good explanation of where revanchism comes from. Okay, I'm going to try and finish. As you can probably tell, this is all a bit of a work in progress. It's not as neat as I wanted it to be by this point. I've tried to, I basically wanted to try and come at revanchism from a different direction, to try and read around it rather than follow the urban studies literature. And I think this helps clarify to a degree why it's important, because it prompts us to focus on culture, policy, and ideology beyond gentrification, but deeply connected to it. I really don't think that revanchism should be seen just as a question of whether or not specific urban policies are intentionally and explicitly vengeful. I think it's much more useful to think about how it's a broader reactionary turn that is discursively vengeful begins to shape policy. So it feeds into an urban world where, for example, it's normalized that you can evict people to make more money, not only normalized, but seen as virtuous, part of the reproduction of progress. I was really struck yesterday by something that Brandy Summers said, when she said that sometimes it's just too much for folks to hold on to, the kind of intersecting axes of exploitation and racism and oppression. And I feel like revanchism in a way does that for gentrification. It kind of blows open the door as a theory. It asks us to see it not as a standalone process that occurs on a flat surface of varying profit rates, but one that is shot through with all the ideological nastiness of a capitalism veering from crisis to crisis. And I guess without sounding too cheesy, I think it's when we think of a politics that isn't revanchism that its contours become clearer, right? So if you imagine the kind of alter ego of a revanchist city would be a kind one, governed perhaps by solidarity or mutual aid or respect, a city that would be safe but not secure in their meaning of the word. If you think of that city for a moment, and then you look at the city in which you live, it should become clearer that perhaps gentrification is something that takes place in a revanchist city and not the other way around. I don't know if I mean, shall I stop there? And I got a minute more, or?
We're getting close, but if it's a minute, Dad, go ahead.
Okay, it's really quick.
I'm enjoying it, so.
Okay, cool. This is my last random thought, and I'm sorry that it is all a bit scattershot, but that's the best I could do in the context. This is what happens when you're stuck indoors for a year, I guess, and all you've got is books. But when rereading The New Urban Frontier and thinking about revanchism, right, I kept thinking about freedom. And I don't know whether this is as prevalent in the USA as it is in the UK, but increasingly it feels like we're in ideologically, really, one of the things that I find really difficult is we're living in an era where freedom seems to have become the discursive property of the far right, or at least a kind of disjointed collection of anti-establishment voices that gravitate towards the far right. So to put it bluntly, in the UK context, we have the most right-wing and authoritarian government we've ever had, but they're also a government that will harp on about freedom at every given opportunity. And for me, to give up the concept of freedom would be a real serious feat. I think one of the things that revanchism does, one of the reasons it's important, is that it recenters freedom at the heart of a counter narrative of what the city might be, right? It recenters freedom at the heart of the city that we want. Just this kind of Henri Lefebvre did with the right to the city. Anyway, there I'll stop. So I guess I probably haven't proved that revanchism is a concept that's that clear to use, really. I may have done the opposite, but hopefully it's been a little bit thought-provoking, and I'll be intrigued to see what you think of it.
Okay. Well, we have a lot of time for questions. If someone put a question in the chat, I know in my role as a discussant, I'm supposed to comment on everything I've just heard, although it's still gestating. So I mean, I actually, while Hamish was talking, I looked to my bookshelf and found a book that it just occurred to me to look at that I wish I had picked up earlier, but I think it's just a great addendum to the conversation. It's a book called, this came out in the late 80s, Yuppies Invade My House at Dinner Time, a tale of brunch, bombs, and gentrification in an American city. And it's about the gentrification of Hoboken. And it's a really great and fascinating book. And I think it's interesting for two reasons based on what Hamish was saying and what Zaire was saying, and to some degree what Derek was saying. I mean, the book, first of all, it's just a bunch of letters to the editor, to the Hudson Reporter, about people complaining about Hoboken, being inundated with yuppies from Midtown Manhattan, like these Gordon Geckos, fleeing, Manhattan to like set up shop in a cheaper spot and just across the Hudson. And it's a fascinating book because if you read the letters, they're not talking about, they never mention the word gentrification. They talk about everything but gentrification. They talk about, aesthetics. They talk about the person a yuppie they saw in, the library, like, asking for some obscure, operetto, and they're just put off by it. And what's kind of what I thought was interesting, because it was sort of what Zaire was saying, is the ways we talk about gentrification without talking about gentrification, or the ways when we use aesthetics or design or a crack house as a way to talk about something by not talking about it. It becomes a stand-in for all sorts of other things. And one of the things that the question raised that I think Smith sometimes raises, sometimes we talk about gentrification as a way not to talk about other things. Sort of broader capitalist development, it just becomes a stand-in for all sorts of other structural inequalities. The other thing that I thought was interesting about this book just now was that, yuppies, just think of, Smith starts the chapter with a, kind of discussion of the term yuppie, and it kind of connects to, what I think Derek was saying, and Zaire was saying, in the degree which, there's the production of gentrification, like the economic production of gentrification, or the economic processes that lead to the production of new housing or the renovation of housing. But then there's the production of new identities alongside that, and the relationship between those two. So those identities can be, can become derisive, or they can be, can be claimed. I think there's one of the things I like about Smith is that, as much as a structural Marxist can do, he's very much interested in, the ideological production of the material world, and the kind of dialectical relationship between the production of identities and the production of materiality. So since I haven't read any of these, but now I'm really interested in reading these, I won't continue blathering on, and I'll turn to a question that was submitted by Regina Freer. And this is a question for Derek. Can you comment on the role of social impact investors who are forming REITs and taking advantage of opportunity zone funding, and who are also Black or are often Black-led? In Los Angeles, Regina mentions SOLA as one of the entities. So,
sure, happy to address some of it. I mean, I don't know that company specifically, but I can definitely talk to the idea of, social impact investing is, let's invest, maybe have a slightly lower rate of return on the investment, and then it does some social good. There's the opportunity zones, which was a Trump administration policy to give tax breaks, capital gains tax breaks. If someone had capital gains, they could not pay taxes or pay a much lower tax rate if they dump that into a fund that then invests money for anything. Doesn't have to be affordable housing, just in an area that is low, moderate income. And then if they make profit off that, they don't have to pay any taxes on that too. So it's like a double tax break. And so let me I'll just try to answer with some of this. One, go and look at Norfolk, Virginia. There are 3 public housing projects there. The city has those areas designated as an opportunity zone. They are courting investors because the city doesn't have enough money to raise those public housing projects and do mixed income housing or mixed use housing. And they're low income working class people that have been in these projects for decades. Now, who's courting the investors? Who helped designate that as the opportunity zone? A Black mayor. And the majority of the city council is for this. The only person that is against it is also of color, but represents the residents of the public housing. I've had former students of mine, I taught in urban planning at Virginia Tech before I went to American, and they've come back to me when I'm at American and said, hey, I want to start a fund. I want to do an opportunity zone fund. Would you sit on the board? Can you give me advice? And I say, absolutely not, because you're just in here to make profit. And those students have been white, and some of them have been of color. And the last thing I'll say is, I went to the Aspen Institute Ideas Fest. I mean, amazing. You got millionaires and billionaires hanging out there. I went to one of these salons, a bunch of people with a lot of money. And they asked me, they said, how do we get affordable housing going in the country? We have an affordable housing crisis. And they were talking about this social impact investing. I said, it's easy. I said, all of you sitting around the table, are you willing to make between 4 and 6% on your money, as opposed to 12 to 15%? And most real estate development, 15% rate of return on the investment, that is the standard practice. And they looked at me and they said, absolutely not. Why would we do that? I said, I thought you guys were about social impact investing. And they said, yeah, figure out a social impact investing that does social good and still provides me 15% rate of return. I said, it doesn't exist. I said, I should leave the table now and you guys should stop thinking about this. So this idea of the social impact investing will solve the problem if the people investing in the social impact want that. If they will accept a rate of return that is much lower, we can build a lot of affordable housing. But if they just want 12 to 15% rate of return, we are not going to solve the problem with the opportunity zones and with social impact investing.
Are there other questions? You can raise your hand or if there's questions or comments. I see Sawadi wrote a long comment. Do you want to ask a question or jump in? Or? Okay. Yeah, so let me read it, okay. I was struck during Zaire's talk by the mocking nature of the joke of calling the building the crack house, which also reminded me of some of Derek's findings in his study of Shaw and U Street. Yet a lot of the literature is focused on the aspects of Black culture that are elevated through gentrification. So I wanted to ask both Zaire and Derek about the other ways that anti-Blackness, symbolic violence against poverty, overlooking of structural disparities contributes to cultural displacement, or making the neighborhood one in which long-term residents no longer feel they are welcome. So that's a question for Derek and Zaire.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so in the weeds right now in the writing that it's hard to kind of like, you know, zoom out and think about kind of like broader questions, but I'm gonna spin a little bit the questions, Sawadi, and sort of related to both Derek's and Hamish. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your names, but sort of like this broader question about who's doing the producing and who's doing the consuming, and what we qualify as the actors that produce and the actors that consume. So that in that kind of making that distinction between production and consumption, who are we thinking are participating in that? And the reason I bring this up in relation to your question, Sawadi, is you know, who do we think is creating the dominant discourses and producing the spaces, right? And clearly this comes issues of power and the ways in which those spaces and discourses are produced that sort of mimic or make real the imaginations that are brought on, right? Like the imaginations of what they want for that place, what they envision will that place will be, but also kind of draws on historical kind of relationships to those places. Thinking of the presentation yesterday about upstate New York and the sort of the sort of like I'm coming home version of some ideas of return and gentrification. So in that, and your question about like cultural displacement, I want to kind of feed an idea that it's not a passive, it's not a passive sort of process, right? That there are multiple with differential power and power hierarchies. There are multiple producers, and production also happens not from the, you know, not only from the throes of real estate production, but happens also from community boards and happens from residents who protest and residents that make a scene in a you know, in a space, or residents that and I saw this. There's an organization in Bed-Stuy that's primarily long-term Black middle-class homeowners, and they went through a process, they've gone through a process of really defending the neighborhood, right? And saying, we're gonna keep it in the family, and advocating for long-term residents. And they've engaged government officials, and they've engaged kind of like different sectors of the community. So in doing that, they also are producing, right, these spaces. So they don't, the cultural displacements are not, don't go unchallenged, and sometimes, you know, or are not necessarily fully realized, even if acknowledged that power inequities kind of often result and the growth machine sort of vision results in the absence of the bodies of the people in the long term. But I want to think more, sort of thinking of the agency also of communities of color in keeping their presence also in some regard, and participating in the production from different levers. And so I think part of the question also is how might we think about addressing or helping or aiding and giving more power to those levers structurally.
So let me
taking it in a different direction, but.
Yeah, so there's a question that kind of builds sort of off of what we've been talking about, that I think will bring in Hamish and Derek. I mean, Derek, in your presentation, you know, advanced an argument basically that, you know, we need, you know, any discussion of gentrification will need will benefit from a racial lens. At the same time, Paul Watt asks, you know, and since Hamish is joining us from across the pond, you know, how important do you think race is for understanding gentrification, you know, outside of the US and in different contexts? Paul mentions the UK and Europe, but I mean, we could even go further, you know, beyond kind of the, you know, advanced industrial economy. So, you know, how, you know, taking the conversation more globally, how important is race, or how insignificant or significant is it in understanding the broader phenomenon? Don't jump in at once.
Do you want to go, Derek?
Hamish.
No, Hamish, you go.
Okay.
This is for you.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a tricky question, isn't it? Because I mean, one thing's for sure, listening to the, I'll be blunt. Like I cut my teeth researching gentrification in a city that's like 95% white, right? So Edinburgh, it's not that Edinburgh isn't a racist city. It's just basically always been a vast majority white city, which possibly reflects a kind of racism at a different scale, right? But so I can't, when I sort of read stuff about how like gentrification in American context is kind of, driven by kind of anti-blackness or a kind of racism that's written into housing policy, I could completely agree. But it's hard for me to necessarily transplant that to the context that I study. But this might be a really stupid thing to say, but I'm going to say it because I kind of this is a thought in progress, right? So don't beat me up if it's wrong. But like I did recently read Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, and it's brilliant, and I think his argument basically is that the categorization of humanity into groups of people that can be treated differently is fundamental to how capitalism works and always has been. And actually, a lot of his argument is about Europe. It's not about 20th century America, at least in the sort of historical side of it. And I guess so when I think of the notion of racial capitalism, to me, the way that I can use that outside of in a context that's familiar to me is to think of a capitalism that's been built on racial exploitation. And certainly then, if you start to look at historically where Edinburgh's wealth comes from or how it develops as a city, you then are telling a very different story in terms of the link to racism. And you could tell the same for any British city, right? And Scotland, I think, is really waking up to that in terms of historical discussions about role in the slave trade and the filtering of money back into Scotland and so on and so forth. Really amazing historical research done on that in recent years. So for me, I still think racial capitalism is an exhilarating idea because it helps us to understand how processes like dehumanization, like stigmatization, like kind of the disposal of certain groups of people whose lives are seen as less worthy is written into capitalism at its very core. And of course, in contexts where there's massive racial divides, that's going to be really viscerally racialized in terms of a black-white division. In Edinburgh, it's not, but I still think the lessons of racial capitalism are really, really important. And I don't know what to do with that really, because obviously you can't import, it's difficult to deal with that. But that would be my sort of random thought. I don't know if that makes sense, but there we go.
So we have 2 minutes. So maybe Derek, do you?
Well, I just wanted to jump in on sort of race and looking at gentrification through a racial lens in other contexts, whether it's the UK or Britain, and we're looking at London, maybe we're looking at Paris or Lyon, in France. I mean, I look at it this way, and usually I have a couple drinks before I get so blunt, but maybe it's just, but look, I mean, there's a history of colonization, and then there's this history of slavery. And I think when others look at the US, they think of this intense, terrible history of slavery and capitalism. And then when you go to Europe, it's like a history of colonization and a social welfare state. But there's different logics of exploitation, but these are histories of exploitation and exploiting people of color in different areas around the world and in different ways. And even if there is a smaller percentage of people of color in London or in Edinburgh, there is a whole history of exploitation and discrimination based on race and based on skin color throughout the histories of, Western Europe and then in the United States, but a different form. And so, and you know, and solid, you know, Tom has been to Tom Slater, you know, spent a lot of time in South Africa. I mean, look at that. I mean, so it's, I understand that. I think the racial lens is helpful in many different contexts. But I know people jump to like, oh, well, your country was worse and its history was worse. It's like, it's all bad. You know, I remember talking with Loic Lequant about, you know, France, and he studied in France and then studied the United States. And he says that you can't really compare neighborhood poverty or the history of racial exploitation. And I'm like, I see a lot of parallels. I don't know, call me crazy. Between France's history, it just, the poverty was on the periphery. In the United States in the 20th century, it was in the inner city, but still seems kind of similar. And I would just say that I think there is nuances and differences, but exploitation is exploitation. And that has happened in many countries and primarily has happened to people of color.
So let me, people in the chat are just saying, Zaire needs to speak on this. This is her wheelhouse. So
go.
No, well, I mean, it's less my wheelhouse than I think kind of contextualizing from the 16th century on how white supremacy has kind of been a feature of globally, right? And so to think of our worlds absent of the particular subjects that that we might face in a particular environments, to think of the ways in which white supremacy has been a constant in all aspects of the development of our history from 1492 on. So conquest, right, happened from Europe, and most of the imperial powers and the assets developed in Europe came from processes of colonization and conquest. So to kind of acknowledge that, right, and how the sources of rich and power came from these processes, is to acknowledge that all built structures, right, and all processes are marked by, sorry, I have a lot of background noise, street noise, by processes of racialization, right? Like that our worlds are racialized regardless of whether there is a diversity, right? Like Denmark is a racial space, it's a racialized space, whether, given its colonization history, whether it includes people of color today or not. So I think that part of the challenges, and this is where I think Cedric Robinson is important, and thinking of racial capitalism, is that we kind of like have bought some spaces and logics as neutral, as unracialized or de-racialized, when in fact they are racialized given history's production. So I think it's not necessarily a particular way of seeing gentrification or any processes. It's actually that we have to acknowledge that it is part of all historical and current and present processes, whatever we study. That people want to study it or not directly, it's another thing. But there is always a racialized angle to, I think, all our social, historical, political processes, given 16th century on.
All right. I think we are over time, but I wish we could keep talking because I have all sorts of things I'd like to say, but let's respect the break. And thank you. I know we can't really clap on this platform effectively, but if we could give our panelists a round of applause. It's been really great, and we'll look forward to reading the book chapters or articles that come out of this. Thanks so much. Okay.